A single rumor turned a continent into a graveyard of expeditions, and it started with one man covered in gold dust, standing on a raft in the middle of a silent lake. Was El Dorado ever a place at all? Or was it a person, the Golden Man, a living symbol mistaken for a destination? And if the story began as a ritual, how did it mutate so fast into a golden city, then a golden empire, and eventually a golden lake that cartographers drew with confidence they did not deserve? In this investigation, we're going to do something most retellings don't, and we'll keep one question pinned to the wall the entire time. Did anyone ever find anything real, or was it all mass delusion powered by greed? By the end, you'll see the most unsettling possibility. El Dorado may have been true, just not as a city. So grab a coffee or your favorite snack and welcome to another episode of Deep Records.
El Dorado didn't begin as a city, it began as a person. Spanish accounts and later historical summaries point to a specific meaning. El Dorado, the Gilded One, a ruler, not a destination. The question you and I have to hold on to is simple. What ritual could be so vivid that outsiders started treating it like geography? Here's what we can verify. In the Muisca highlands of present-day Colombia, sacred lakes were not scenery, they were ceremonial centers. Offerings were placed into water, crafted gold objects, valuables, acts meant to bind leadership, community, and the sacred landscape. Over time, one lake becomes the recurring stage in retellings, Lake Guatavita, near today's Bogota. Archaeological and art historical research ties the El Dorado origin story to this world of lake offerings and political initiation. The most important physical breadcrumb is small enough to fit in a museum case, the Muisca raft, a gold alloy figure scene made by lost wax casting, showing a chief on a raft surrounded by attendants. Smart history highlights why this object matters. It visually matches the initiation ceremony tradition, a new leader presented in a lake context, framed by offerings. It's documentary proof that the Golden Man was not a fantasy invention. It was an image with roots. But we should be precise about uncertainty. The raft doesn't give us a date-stamped eyewitness account. It gives us a cultural snapshot, strong but not complete. You and I need to understand why Europeans kept saying Golden City when the earliest reports didn't describe a city at all. The earliest accounts describe a gold man, a leader covered in gold dust as part of a ceremony. But once that story entered colonial paperwork, it stopped being a ritual and started becoming a location. Archaeologists and historians studying Muisca society point out an uncomfortable detail for the conquistadors' imagination. The Muisca didn't control major gold mines in their own territory. Much of their gold arrived through trade networks and was used in offerings, adornment, and political display. In that world, gold is not just wealth, it's cultural power. Symbol, status, and obligation, often meant to be given away, not stored. Now add a quiet twist. Many objects weren't pure gold, they were made of tumbaga, a gold-copper alloy. Through techniques like surface depletion gilding, it could look richer than it was. Evidence suggests outsiders may have mistaken brilliance for abundance and abundance for a hidden treasury. And here's the mechanism. They didn't search for a myth, they searched for coordinates. Each retelling adds distance and removes context. Soon you'll watch El Dorado move again, not on the ground, but on paper.
Lake Guatavita is where the El Dorado legend stops being a story and becomes a work site. A cold crater lake above the Colombian plateau, steep walls, thin air, and a single idea that refuses to die. The offerings are down there, so the lake becomes the loot box everyone thinks they can crack. Here's the procedural reality. For centuries, outsiders tried to lower the water, cutting channels, hauling mud, improvising dredges. They did recover some objects, not because the myth was true, but because the ritual site was real.
Archaeologists and ethno-historical research treat Guatavita as a major Muisca ceremonial landscape, shaped and damaged by repeated extraction attempts. Then comes the modern turn, 1898, British-backed industrial ambition. Contractors Limited and related ventures tunnel into the crater rim to drain the basin. Pumps, sluices, mercury capture systems, engineering meant to turn sacred sediment into inventory. And this is the moment you need to hold in your head. They didn't find a city, they found a problem. The lake bed wasn't a clean floor, it was meters of soft mud that you couldn't stand on. Then, under sun, it baked into a cement-like crust. The tunnel clogged. Rains refilled the basin. Recoveries were real but limited, measured in small lots, not in a treasury. So yes, offerings likely existed, but scale and access are everything. A partial truth fuels a total myth. And when reality refuses to cooperate, the legend mutates. Because after Guatavita didn't pay out, the city doesn't disappear, it moves.
In 1596, Sir Walter Raleigh publishes his account of searching the Guyana interior. In his pages, El Dorado is no longer a ritual or a rumor at the edge of known routes. It becomes Manoa, a city anchored to a vast inland water he describes as a kind of natural highway into wealth. Raleigh's text doesn't just report what he saw, it translates hearsay, guides claims, and political desire into a narrative that sounds like geography. And then the maps arrive. Look at the charts from the 1600s onward, you'll see it repeated. Lake Parim, a wide oval of water, and on its shore, Manoa, sometimes labeled outright as El Dorado. The same lake is copied from one map to the next, ink borrowing authority from earlier ink. Maps don't just describe the world, sometimes they invent it. A line of ink can send men to die. Now zoom back out from the paper. Guyana is not a blank space. It's rivers that braid and unbraid, savannas that flood, forests that swallow trails in weeks. Later explorers begin to notice the problem. The lake stays stable on maps, but the land does not. By the early 1800s, Alexander von Humboldt's surveys and conclusions undermined the idea of a permanent Lake Parim, pointing instead to seasonal flooding and shifting wetlands that could mimic a great lake to travelers and mapmakers hungry for certainty. Modern remote sensing and landscape studies echo the same suspicion, a real dramatic hydrology misread as fixed geography. But don't close the case yet. Even if the lake was wrong, why did the gold rumors never die?
Picture this, then strip away the exaggeration. Not a city plated in gold, not streets that glitter. Instead, a society where gold is used the way modern states use flags, laws, and monuments, as a system of authority and meaning. Archaeologists and ethnographers describe the Muisca as a network of chiefdoms on the high Andean plateau, dense communities, organized agriculture, maize, potatoes, quinoa, managed around altitude, seasons, and stored surplus. Power didn't need palaces, it needed coordination, tribute, messengers, ritual calendars, and sacred geography that everyone recognized. Now zoom in on Lake Platavita. Modern archaeological framing treats it less like a lost treasure vault and more like a ritual site, an engineered place for offerings, repeated over generations. That's where the Muisca raft becomes crucial. Many researchers interpret the raft not as fantasy art, but as a symbolic record of a ceremony. A leader, elevated, transformed into a public figure through ritual, while offerings move from human hands into the water, into the unseen. And here's the part most people miss. Where does the gold come from? Not necessarily local mines. Evidence across the region points to acquisition through trade routes, alloying techniques, and recycling older ritual objects. Gold wasn't just wealth, it was social technology, portable, meltable, recast into meaning. Not magic, not miracle, infrastructure. Hold on to that, because if El Dorado was built like this, ritual plus logistics, then destroying it would be far harder than finding it.
So here's the uncomfortable answer. El Dorado was not a place. It was a narrative that adapts to disappointment. When one target failed to produce a city you could point to and claim, the story didn't die. It simply changed shape. A ritual became a lake became a city became an empire.
And when none of that could be verified, it became something even harder to disprove. A feature on a map, a promise pushed farther into the frontier, always just beyond the line where certainty begins. And the evidence? It points to something quieter, yet more powerful. Historians tracking the expeditions don't see a single vanishing destination. They see a repeating pattern. Reports inflated by fear and hope, second-hand testimony treated as coordinates, and every failure converted into proof that the real prize lay farther on. John Hemming's The Search for El Dorado lays it out as a system, each expedition feeding the next with the same ingredients: ambition, rumor, and the need for a return on blood and money. Why did they keep believing? Because sunk costs don't just drain wallets, they trap reputations. Because empires reward momentum, not caution. Because some gold did exist, enough to keep the chase plausible. And because texts like Raleigh's account could be read not as literature, but as a lead. A myth doesn't need to be true to be lethal. It only needs to keep moving. And when you look back at that raft, you realize the final twist. El Dorado didn't vanish. It evolved into a machine that manufactures pursuit.
Gold dust falls into dark water. It doesn't sink like a coin. It blooms, spreads, and disappears. That's the real ending of El Dorado. Not a city found or lost, a legend that changes shape every time someone needs it to be real. Archaeologists can trace the small truths behind it: rituals, trade, metallurgy, political power. But obsession turns those truths into weapons. Maps become promises. Artifacts become proof of what someone already decided to hunt. El Dorado is what happens when a small truth meets a huge hunger. And once that hunger takes control, even evidence stops being evidence. It becomes permission.